I call on our government to join on me in supporting this campaign to stop executions and to demand a demand which was reiterated just last week by human rights experts from the UN. We now have concrete evidence, both from the UN Special Rapporteur and the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission, that the religious dictatorship in Iran was built on and survives through committing crimes against humanity.
So we have this ridiculous debate here about whether or not the IRGC should be prescribed. Now, I was astonished when I first came to this to find they hadn't already been prescribed, and not just because of their brutal actions in Iran and their involvement, but it's their actions over here. We have a real problem because a British government refuses point blank, and so far has refused point blank, to deal with the IRGC and their activities over here.
The protests, the uprisings, the voices of the people calling out in a demand for democracy, justice, freedom and humanity must be recognised, affirmed and acknowledged as the true voice of Iran. The executions must be atoned for, the regime's criminal actions must be prosecuted, the condemnation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and its proscription as a terrorist organisation on the United Kingdom terrorist organisations list must be affirmed. Once upon a time, the United Kingdom in 1953 was on the wrong side. The 1953 intrusion into Iran political integrity to undermine it, to undo it, to introduce repression and autocracy must never be repeated. Support for the theocratic dictatorship instituted in 1979 must be ended. It is time for the United Kingdom to make clear the country's support of democracy, freedom, justice and humanity for Iran. I call on the United Kingdom government to affirm its support for democracy, freedom, justice and humanity for Iran.
Now, the previous government always told us, we will review this, we'll keep this under accounts. The current government, when in opposition, promised solemnly to prescribe the IRGC. Before the summer recess, I called on ministers to honour their promise. Sadly, we're still waiting, but you can be assured that we here will keep the pressure up on the government to do what they said they would do.
Our focus at this time must be on the increased executions, the repression of democracy, the institutionalized oppression of women and girls, and the need to combat the impunity of the perpetrators of the assassinations, executions and massacres, especially the 1988 massacre, as we remember all those who have been killed. In the words of Mr. Javed Rahman, the 1988 massacre represents the commission of the worst and most egregious human rights abuses of our living memory, whereby high-ranking state officials connived, conspired, and actively engaged to plan, order, and commit crimes against humanity and genocide against nationals of their own state.
Since the 2022 uprisings, we have witnessed a surge of protests, strikes, and acts of resistance, which clearly show that the people of Iran refuse to be cowed into submission. Their desire for freedom is undeniable and unstoppable. Your movement offers not only a platform to opposition to the regime, but also sends a clear and democratic vision for the future of Iran, seen in your admirable 10-point plan, a future based on the rule of law, gender equality, and human rights.
So I contrasted in that article in 2003 the government's burgeoning love affair with a regime developing weapons of mass destruction and its attitude towards those, like Madam Rajavi, committed to democracy, human rights, and the creation of a plural, diverse society. But while I was digging out that article, I also came across this. This is a booklet that I was part of the group that published it in 1986. Since then, governments have come and gone, but the threat posed by the regime, which we've too often appeased, has simply got worse and worse, now described by the government's reviewer of national defence, Lord Robertson, as part of a deadly quartet. The things we discussed in 1986, the things we discussed in 2002, happening again and again even today. Spearheaded by the NCRI, it provides a viable alternative. It mobilizes resistance units inside Iran and gains international support for the Iranian people's fight for democracy and freedom.
The regime's actions have not stifled the rights of its own people. Have not only stifled the rights of its own people, but have also contributed to regional and global insecurity. Despite decades of brutal repression and well-documented crimes against humanity by the regime, the people of Iran have not been silenced. As we would say in Northern Ireland, more power to your elbow. We must stand with the Iranian people, with you, Madam Rajavi, with the NCRI, as they fight for a future built on justice, democracy and peace.
Simply, for the new MPs and new politicians, get the message across about the young men that were hanged from the crane gibbets in Tehran. Tell them about the judge who, having witnessed a young woman telling the world how she'd been raped and assaulted by this man, because she spoke out. Tell them about the judge who said, take her away and hang her. And that's what they did. Tell them about Camp Ashraf and the slaughter that took place there when people dared to speak out against the regime.
The murders and atrocious breaches of human rights continue in Iran, and we should continue to join together in taking whatever steps we can to suppress that dreadful, dreadful regime.
Things, I hope, now will change. We have had a change of government here, and I would just say to colleagues that you can change governments in Western democracies quite frequently. All these things ought to point to our diplomats and our Foreign Office advising the Foreign Secretary now to take stronger steps on Iran and withdraw all support, direct or indirect, private or public, from the Iranian regime.
I was 4 years old when the Revolutionary Guards of the Iranian brutal regime burst into our house. We were sleeping at night with my sister, and they burst into our house and at gunpoint took my parents to prison. The next 3 years after that, I spent my time as a kid in between prison and with my family outside of prison. I saw firsthand the brutality of the regime in that their idea of entertaining a child was to take them to see how they were whipping women in prison. I used to go to prison sometimes. I met my mother's friends. The next time I went, they weren't there anymore. So, Professor Javed Rahman's historic report, for me, who has witnessed this brutality, means a lot. So, I'm here to just basically express my gratitude for this report to be out.
For the first time now, it's been recorded the crimes against humanity and genocide committed by the Iranian regime in 1988, when 30,000 political prisoners, members and supporters of the PMOI, were executed en masse across Iran. They were each individually asked whether they would denounce the PMOI and their beliefs. What that really meant was whether they were prepared to denounce the principle of their resistance for freedom and democracy and resistance against tyranny and oppression. Each of them responded to their torturers and executioners in robust fashion, knowing the consequences, and were taken to their execution.